Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. This is going to be the first episode of our new series, which we have named Interchange. And why is it an interchange? Because what we're going to do in this series is to pick a question that has been asked in the developer community, and we are going to invite someone, a member from the developer community, maybe the developer who has asked the question or the developer who has answered that question, to participate with us in this series. The series is going to be published on Fridays, every Friday. And let's start with our first episode. Today we have our new guest. Let me introduce him. Okay, and here we have Baman Ashtari. Hello, Baman. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Alba. Yes, of course. My name is Bahman Ashtari. I work for CBT Nuggets. I'm a senior software engineer with focus on Salesforce development. CBT Nuggets is an e-learning platform focused on networking technologies. We have on-demand videos for self-training, people that want to train themselves and go for certificates. I'm super happy to be here, especially since this is the first episode of this interesting series.
Amazing, Baman. Thank you so much for joining us today. And well,
Thank you.
Baman is here today because he was the person who asked a question on Stack Exchange. Is the question that you have in the screen right now. And Baman, what did you want it to do exactly?
Well, yeah, as the question says, I wanted to basically populate a Lightning data table, and the data existed in Salesforce, but the main source of the data that came through an outside source through an Apex endpoint, and then the Apex endpoint needed to basically link up the data with the one existing in Salesforce. And in my data table, I wanted to have a column that gets populated with contact email addresses, and I wanted these email addresses to be clickable. So when you click on each row, on a single email address in a row, the actual contact related to that email address opens up in a different page or in a different tab. So that was my main purpose for doing this.
Great. So I remember when I saw this question for the first time, the question really reminded me a recipe that we have in one of our sample apps. If you don't know the sample app, Visualforce to LWC, it contains some examples that help you move from Visualforce to Lightning Web Components, and having a Lightning data table with a clickable column was one of the use cases, because in Visualforce is relatively straightforward to create a list with record links, and we wanted to propose a similar solution in Lightning Web Components. So when I saw Baman's question, I told him to take a look at this recipe here. This is in Visualforce to LWC GitHub repo. If you Google that, you are going to find it. But instead of taking a look at the recipe, what we are going to do today is to implement the solution from scratch and giving a solution to the exact requirements that Baman had, which are having a column with emails that are clickable and that send you to every individual contact record page, right? Okay, so the first thing that we are going to do is to create a Lightning data table, because that is exactly what Baman wanted to create. Lightning data table is a base component that you can find in the Lightning Web Components documentation that shows rows for your records, right? If you go to the documentation tab, here you are going to find how to define the columns. So in the columns, normally what you specify is a label, a field name, and then the type. And there are some standard types that you can use. For instance, type text, or type percent, or type currency. Normally the types for Lightning-datatable match the types that you can use in Salesforce record fields, right? But what we want to do is something kind of special, because we want a column that contains an email that is linkified and then navigates to the contact record page. Yeah, and do you know any tool that we can use in Lightning-datatable to implement that?
Yes, so Lightning-datatable provides capabilities to create a custom data type for a cell if the data type that we want the cell to have doesn't already exist as a standard type. So I think we can use the custom data types here.
Yeah, amazing. So if in the documentation you look for custom types, you're going to find a section called Creating Custom Data Types that explain to you how to define a custom type for a column, right? So that the cells have the appearance and the behavior that you want. And that is what we are going to implement today. But we are going to implement the solution in different iterations, and the first thing that we are going to do is to just implement a simple data table that retrieves contacts, and when we have that, then we are going to work in the Lightning custom type. So here I am in VS Code. I have already created an organization with an app page. I have created a component, which is the component in which we are going to include our Lightning data table, and we are going to start creating the component. So here I'm going to go back to the examples because I want to copy the most basic example template for using a Lightning data table. And here you can see that there are two parameters that we need to set. First of all, we need to set the columns parameter. We want to define the columns that our data table is going to have. And second, we need to set the data, the records that we want to set in the Lightning data table. So first of all, let's work on the columns. To define the columns, you need to use an structure that is defined in the documentation, the one that we have just seen, in which you explain which columns do you want to have and which types should they be. So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to copy some code that I have prepared just for not spending too much time on this initial setup, right? So first thing that we are going to do is to import here the field names that we are going to use for the columns. And second, I'm going to copy the definition of the columns. I'm going to define a variable here. And for this variable, I'm defining three different columns. The first column is the name. It's going to be of type text. The second column is the email. For now, it is going to be of type email because we want to create a simple table first. And finally, we have a third column, which is the phone, right? Great. So we saw here that we have a columns property. So we need to define the columns property here, and we are going to assign to it the variable that we have created. And we need to define also the data. To get the data, to retrieve the data, we are going to do that with Apex, right? And for that, we're going to create an Apex controller. Indeed, what I have done is to already create it, okay? Here I have my Apex controller. In the Apex controller, I have defined a static method. This static method returns a list of contacts. We are querying the name, the email, and the phone because we need to have those fields in our table. And I'm setting the method as cacheable. So now, as I have my contact controller method created, what we can do is to invoke that Apex method from our JavaScript file. For that, what we need to do is to import the method from Salesforce Apex and the name of the class and the method. And then there are two ways in which you can invoke Apex, but what we're going to do is to use the wire service. The wire service allows you to delegate the invocation of the Apex method to a service. For instance, if I was passing parameters to these methods and I change the value of those parameters, the wire service is going to provide a new value. If the object that is stored in the Lightning Data Service cache changes, then the wire service is going to provide a new value as well, right? And how do we store that value? What we can do is to decorate a property or a function. In our case, we are going to decorate a property, and that way, every time that the wire service provides a new value, the contacts.data property is going to contain that value. Okay? So here, but really what we want to link here are the records that may be returned by the wire service, and those records are going to live in the contacts.data property. So I believe that our first iteration of the Lightning-datatable component is ready. So what we are going to do now is to push the component to our organization, and we are going to see if we have what we wanted to. So here I have the app page in which I have included the component, and if I refresh the page, we are going to see here that we have our Lightning data table. But what happens here? This column is an email type. If I click on the email, what's going to happen is that an email is going to be sent to Jon Snow, right? But what we want to do is not that. What we want to do is to open the record page, right, Bama?
Exactly, that's correct. I think it would be interesting to send an email to Jon Snow, but yes, we want to open that contact in a new page.
Could be. So for that, what we are going to do is to use this amazing custom types functionality that you will be able to find in the documentation, and that allows you to define a custom look and feel and behavior for a column in a Lightning data table. So to create a custom type, the first thing that you have to do is to create a custom Lightning data table that extends the standard, the default Lightning data table. And for that, we are going to look that piece of code in the documentation. Here it is. And we are going to copy it. I'm going to create a new component, which is going to be my data table. I'm going to copy the sample implementation from the documentation, and we're going to start creating our custom type. The custom type in the documentation is this one. It's a delete row button, but we're going to create a custom type which is a clickable email. So we are going to name the custom type clickable email. We are going to use a template which defines how the custom type looks like and behave. We are going to call it clickable email template. And this template is something that we are going to define in the same folder of the custom data table component that we are creating. As you can see here, we are importing this template from the same directory in which we are. So that means that what we need to do is to create here a new file called clickable-email-template.html. And here we are going to define the template that is going to be used to render the cells of our columns. For now, I'm going to use a very basic template so that we can see how it's being used in our column. And I'm going to use this value parameter because this value is linked to the field that we are specifying in the column definition, and you are going to see why in a second. Okay, there are other parameters that you can define for your custom type. For instance, if you want to use the standard cell layout or a bare one, in which there are no padding or margins or anything, I'm going to stick to the standard cell layout. And here you can specify additional type attributes. For now, we are going to leave it as it is. We have our template. This is going to represent every individual cell in my custom type column. And we are going to indicate our data table component that instead of using the email type, we want to use our custom type. So remember that I call my custom type clickable email, right? So what we need to do is to say here that instead of using the email type, we want to use the clickable email. But one second, because here I'm not using my custom Lightning data table, right? We need to change this. We are not going to use the Lightning data table anymore. We are going to use my custom my data table. Great, so I think this should work. Let's push it to the organization. Do you think it's going to work, Baman?
You wrote the code, so I'm sure it works.
Okay. Amazing. So at least it deployed. And we are going to refresh the page. And yeah, there it is. This is my custom type template. This is exactly what we are defining in the template. And remember, I was using the value property. The value property is showing the email because in the definition of the column, I pass in the email as the field name. And wherever you pass in the field name is going to be evaluated, and it's going to be the value that then you can reference in your template.
Excuse me, Alba. I have a couple of questions. One of my questions is that how can we reference more record fields? So right now we are populating value. What if we wanted to show more field values from that record on this custom type template? And my other question is that in which case do you need a separate component for the template? So how do you know that you have to create an actual separate component in this case?
All right, so let's go first to the first question that you had, because here, what do we need to be able to create something like a link that navigates to record ID, right? And that has the email here. So imagine these are like variables, okay? To have that, we already have the email, right? This was the value. So we can go ahead and write here the value, but we also need the record ID, and we need to evaluate the record ID for each row. So for that, what we are going to do is to pass an attribute. These are the sample attributes that come with the example, right? But instead of using these attributes, we are going to use another attribute, which is our record ID. That means that in your component, you are going to be able to access that record ID doing type attributes dot record ID. And now in our implementation, in which we are defining the columns, the custom column with that custom type clickable email, we need to pass a value to that attribute. If the attribute is something fixed, for instance, string, right? I could pass the string this way. If I pass in a fixed value, then that fixed value is going to be used in all the rows. Let's refresh this. And we are going to inspect this element. So if you see here, in every row, I'm using the fixed value that I pass into that attribute. But we don't want a fixed value. We want to do something similar to what we are doing, passing in this field name, that we are making the Lightning-datatable evaluate that field and store the result on the value property. But we want to do the same here. The good news is that that is very easy to do. If you want to do something like that, what you need to do is, instead of passing a string, you need to pass an object in which you define the field name. In our case, we want to pass the record ID. So what we're going to pass in is the field API name for the contact ID field, so that the Lightning-datatable can evaluate it. So I'm going to push these changes, and we are going to see if now we got to render the record ID correctly for each row. Let's take a look at one of the cells, and there we have the record ID and we have the email, right? Now, what we could do is to append here like a slash, right? What happens is that is not the best practice, because we may change URL formats. Today is this format, but we don't know if in the future it's going to be the same format. So if you need to perform navigations in Lightning Web Components, instead of hard coding the URLs, we recommend to use the navigation service. Have you heard about the navigation service, Baban?
Yes, I'm familiar with the navigation service in the Lightning Web Components.
Okay, so you are going to see that it's easy to use it, it's super well documented. In the developer guide, you are going to find all the possibilities that you can do with the navigation service. Basically, there are a couple of methods that you can use to navigate to pages, to generate URL for pages, and many page reference formats that you can navigate to. In our case, what we're going to do is to navigate to the record page. And remember, Baban asked a question before. He said, hey, when should I use a template? When should I give a step further and create like a secondary component? And my response was that if you need to create some JavaScript for the template, then what you will need to do is to create a secondary component that includes your template. So that is what we are going to do now. This is going to be our final step. We are going to create another component which is going to be called clickable email. This is going to be really our cell template. And we're going to move what we had here to our clickable email cell template. Here, instead of setting the anchor link, we are going to reference our clickable email component that we have just created. And we are going to configure it to use the navigation service. So to use the navigation service, instead of navigate using the H reference of our anchor links, what we are going to do is to call a method in our component that performs the navigation for us. Okay, navigate to record, for instance. Navigate to record. Then this method is something that we are going to define in the JavaScript files. This is where we will navigate to record. And obviously, to be able to navigate to a record, we will need to know which is the record ID, right? And that's it. So now I'm going to copy the code for the navigation behavior. You can copy this from the documentation. So normally, what you will do, the simplest way to navigate is to use the navigate method. But one of the requirements of Batman was to be able to open the page in a new tab. And to be able to open the page in a new tab, this is what you will have to do. First, you need to generate the URL. And then, once the promise is resolved, you will need to open the URL this way. Because if you just use the navigate method, this is going to navigate to the record, but in your current tab. Then both methods, the navigate method and the generate URL method, receive a page reference. This is documented in the page I showed you before in the Lightning Web Components documentation. And basically a page reference in our case is going to be a standard record page type. And we're going to pass in the record ID that we want to navigate to, and we want to use the view mode. So here we have the definition of our method. To make our JavaScript class use the navigation service, we need to import the navigation mixing and make the class extend navigation mixing and passing in our Lightning element class. That is a requirement that, again, it's documented. It's something that you need to do every time that you want to use the navigation service. And that's mostly it. Let me take a look at the component again. Okay, there's something else missing. Here, we are using a value property, but remember that value property is not here yet. It's something that we need to pass in from our custom type definition. We are going to change the name because I prefer to use a more meaningful name. We are going to call it email. And we are going to define an API property that is called email. So the last thing that we need to do here is to pass a value to those API properties that we have defined. Remember that we had the email property and we need to pass the value property here. And remember that we had our record ID property and the type, the custom type attribute was type attributes dot record ID, right? So now I'm going to push to the organization. And there it is. We have our email. We are using the new clickable email component that we have just defined. And if I click in one of the rows, I'm correctly redirected to the contact record page thanks to our navigation service. Great, so we have arrived to the end of the session. Before leaving, I wanted to ask you, Baman, do you have a favorite feature in Lightning Web Components, something that is related with we have seen today or similar?
Yes, sure. I would say from something that we have seen today, definitely the navigation mixing is a great feature. I really like it. Another feature that I really like, I would say, is one of my favorite is the Lightning data service, where you can use Salesforce data directly in your Lightning Web Components JavaScript file, very similar to how you pulled in the field names in today's component. I would say those are probably my favorite features, comparing Lightning Web Component to the similar platform and libraries that are out there for front-end development.
I completely agree with you. Those are kind of my favorite features too. I love Lightning data service and the simple way in which you can wire the data, right? And of course, the infinite possibilities of the navigation service. That's amazing. Great. So to finish, I wanted to share some resources. First of all, if you want to know more about Lightning Web Components, go to Trailhead. There are a bunch of Trailhead modules that you can do to not only get started, but also to get more professional with Lightning Web Components. There are modules for different levels: beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And this one is one of my favorites, Build Lightning Web Components. If you want to take a look at today's code, I created a GitHub repo. It's github.com Alba Rivas data table email link if you want to take a look at what we built today. And also remember that there is a recipe in Visualforce to LWC recipes, which is kind of similar. And finally, I wanted to ask you, do you have a question that has been asked in a public community that you want us to deep dive in, same as we did today? Send that question to us. You can optionally participate in the episode if you were involved in the solution or asking that question. And also you can suggest us, members of the community, or people to include as guests in our next episodes of this Interchange series. The form address is this one here, sfdc.co/interchange. There is where you are going to be to find the form and where you will be able to send us your suggested questions. And with that, I just want to remember you the different ways to connect with us. You can connect with us in Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Also, you can follow our developer blog and our developer podcast. And if you are watching this video in YouTube and you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel and click on the bell to receive notifications. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much, Baman, for being there. It's been amazing to do this episode with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Same for me.
Thank you. And hope to see you in the next episode. Bye bye.